I am thrilled to announce her promotion.
She has earned it. Thank you so much, everyone. Hey, what is wrong?
They cut my pay by half. This makes no sense.
I noticed the change in my latest paycheck. Why was my salary reduced?
We had to make some adjustments. It is a company-wide policy for this quarter.
But my performance has been excellent. I cannot accept this.
He stood in front of the entire regional office, called my name over the microphone, and told everyone that I was the future of that company. 2 weeks later, I opened my payslip and found that the same man had cut my salary by almost a third in the very same month he promoted me, without a single word of warning. Before I tell you how I found out, and before I tell you what I uncovered about the real reason behind that restructuring, let me ask you to stay with me to the end of this story. Because if you have ever worked hard for someone who smiled in your face while quietly taking something from you, you need to hear every part of what happened to me. And if stories like this hold your attention the way this one held mine, subscribe to this channel now, because what I found out about my own manager will shock you. My name is Halima Sule, and for 6 years I worked at Zenith Horizon Telecoms, a mid-sized telecommunications and retail company with offices across Abuja, Kaduna, and Kano. I joined as a junior operations officer straight out of university, the kind of entry role where you answer to everyone and get credit from almost no one. And I climbed, slowly and honestly, through sheer consistency, until I became the senior operations coordinator for the entire Abuja regional office, reporting directly to my regional manager, a man named Kabiru Danladi. Kabiru had been at Zenith Horizon longer than I had, a man in his mid-40s with a reputation for charm in meetings and a firm hand behind closed doors. When I first started reporting to him, I admired him. He had a way of making junior staff feel seen, remembering small details about our lives, asking after your family the way a good elder brother would. He remembered my mother's knee surgery in my second year at the company and asked after her recovery for months afterward, without ever making it feel performative. He remembered my younger brother's name and the fact that I was the one quietly funding part of his university fees, and he would sometimes ask, with what seemed like genuine warmth, whether the boy was still doing well in his studies. I worked hard under him, not because I feared him, but because I genuinely believed that if I gave my best, the company and Kabiru himself would recognize it fairly. I came from a family where nothing was ever handed to us easily. My father drove a commercial bus in Kaduna when he passed when I was 19, and my mother raised 4 of us on a seamstress's income that stretched further than it had any right to, through sheer discipline and prayer. I was the first person in my family to finish university, and I carried that weight into every single day of my working life, determined never to give any employer a reason to regret trusting me with responsibility. That determination is, I think, part of why the eventual betrayal cut as deeply as it did, because I had built my entire sense of professional worth on the belief that consistent, honest effort would always eventually be met with consistent, honest reward. For 4 years, I built what became the backbone of our regional operations. I redesigned our customer complaint resolution process, cutting our average response time by more than half, a change that came from 3 exhausting months of mapping every single step our customers went through when something went wrong with their service, then rebuilding the entire workflow on my own time, staying back after official closing hours more nights than I can count. I personally trained 11 new staff who came through our department, several of whom now run their own units in other regions, and I still receive messages from a few of them thanking me for teaching them things their official onboarding never covered. When our biggest corporate client, a logistics firm with contracts across 3 states, threatened to leave us over a billing dispute in my second year in the role, I was the one who sat with their finance team for 2 weeks straight, untangling months of miscommunication between our billing system and theirs, working through weekends, missing a cousin's naming ceremony because I could not risk leaving that negotiation unattended for even a single day. I remember the exact moment their finance director finally signed the renewed contract and how my hands were shaking with relief and exhaustion in equal measure, because that account was worth hundreds of millions of naira annually, and losing it would have meant layoffs across our department. Kabiru took that particular win to the managing director himself and presented it largely as evidence of his own team's strength under his leadership, standing before senior executives in Lagos describing the strategic decisions that had saved the account, decisions that in reality had been made almost entirely by me at a conference table with a client's exhausted finance staff at 11 o'clock at night. I did not mind at the time. I told myself that a good manager's success should reflect on his people and that my own reward would come eventually in its own season. I had been raised to believe that patience was a virtue that always, eventually, paid its debts. That season, I believed, finally arrived on a Thursday morning in March during our regional town hall, an event held in our largest conference hall with every staff member from the Abuja office present, plus a video link to Kaduna and Kano. Kabiru stood at the front of that hall, thanked the regional teams for a strong quarter, and then, without any warning to me at all, called my name. Halima Suli, he said, smiling broadly into the microphone, has been the quiet engine behind this office for years, and it is time the company recognized that publicly. He announced in front of nearly 90 colleagues and several senior executives visiting from Lagos that I was being promoted to Regional Operations Manager, a title that would put me one step below him in the regional hierarchy, overseeing 3 full teams instead of 1. The hall erupted in applause. Colleagues I had trained years earlier stood and clapped for me specifically. My friend and closest colleague in the office, a woman named Fatima Garba, who worked in customer relations, hugged me so tightly I nearly lost my breath, whispering in my ear that I had finally gotten what I deserved. I want you to imagine what that moment felt like, because it will make what came next even harder to understand. I had worked 6 years for that company. I had sacrificed evenings, missed my younger brother's wedding rehearsal because of a client emergency, turned down 2 other job offers from competitors, one of them offering nearly 20% more than I was earning at the time, because I believed my future was being built brick by brick at Zenith Horizon, with people who genuinely valued what I brought to the table. Standing in that hall, hearing my name called out as an example for the entire regional office, watching senior executives who had flown in from Lagos nod approvingly in my direction, I felt for the first time in a while that the years of quiet, unglamorous work had finally been seen.
After the town hall ended, several colleagues stopped me in the hallway to congratulate me personally. Some of them people I had trained years earlier, who now told me with visible emotion that watching me rise gave them hope for their own paths within the company. My mother cried on the phone that evening when I told her, telling me that my late father would have been proud beyond words to see how far I had come from the small room we all shared in Katina. I remember driving home that night with the windows down, the Abuja evening air warm against my face, feeling for the first time in a long while that every difficult sacrifice had been worth exactly what it cost. If a story like this has ever happened to you, or if you have ever poured yourself into work that someone else quietly took credit for, subscribe to this channel now, because you are not going to believe what I discovered less than 3 weeks later. The formal promotion letter arrived exactly 9 days after the town hall, delivered by our HR coordinator with the usual documentation, a revised job title, a revised reporting structure showing 3 team leads now reporting to me instead of directly to Kabiru, and a note stating that my compensation adjustment would reflect in the following month's payroll cycle, in line with the company's standard promotion procedure. I signed it without reading every line as carefully as I should have, because I trusted, the way I had trusted for 6 years, that the company would do right by me. My salary alert came through at the end of that following month, and I remember exactly where I was, sitting in my car outside my mother's house in Karu, engine off, waiting for my sister to come out so we could drive to the market together. I had already, foolishly perhaps, begun mentally planning small changes for the coming months, a slightly better arrangement for my brother's school fees, finally replacing the ceiling fan in my mother's sitting room that had been groaning for over a year, maybe even setting aside something toward a car of my own instead of the shared family vehicle I had been driving since university. I opened the alert, expecting to see the increase reflected, already half smiling at the thought of it. Instead, the figure on my screen was lower than what I had been earning before the promotion, not slightly lower, almost a third lower than my previous salary on a title that was supposed to be a step up, not a step down. I read the figure 3 times, certain my eyes were deceiving me, then opened my full banking app to compare it against the previous month's deposit, my hands suddenly cold, despite the Abuja heat pressing against the car windows. There was no mistake in my reading. The number was simply inexplicably smaller. My sister came out of the house a few minutes later, met my silence with concern, and I remember telling her it was nothing, that I would sort it out on Monday, because some part of me still needed to believe in that moment that this was a simple clerical error rather than something deliberate. My first instinct was to assume it was payroll error, the kind of mistake that happens in large organizations more often than people realize. I called our payroll officer, a soft-spoken young man named Tunde in the Lagos head office, the following morning, careful to keep my tone light and professional rather than accusatory. I had worked with Tunde several times over the years on routine matters, and he had always been forthcoming, sometimes even apologetic when systems moved slower than they should. This time, though, there was a different quality to his voice from the very first sentence, a carefulness that felt rehearsed rather than natural. He checked the system while I waited on the line, the faint clicking of his keyboard the only sound between us for almost a full minute, and then told me, in a voice that suggested he was reading from a script rather than explaining something he fully understood himself, that my new salary reflected a grade harmonization exercise that had been implemented across several regional roles that same quarter, and that he was not in a position to explain the details beyond what payroll had been instructed to process. I pressed him gently, asking whether he could at least confirm which other roles or regions had been affected by this harmonization, since I wanted to understand whether this was something happening company-wide or specific to my own position. He hesitated, and in that hesitation I heard something I had not expected from a conversation I assumed would end in a quick and reassuring correction. "Halima," he said, finally, his voice dropping slightly, as though he did not want anyone near him in the Lagos office to overhear. "I only process what comes down to me. I cannot tell you where the instruction originated." I asked him plainly, had my promotion come with a pay cut disguised as a grade adjustment? He hesitated long enough that I understood, even before he answered, that the question made him deeply uncomfortable. He told me he could not comment further and suggested I raise the matter with my line manager directly, since compensation decisions for regional roles were, in his words, approved locally before payroll ever touches them. That word locally sat with me for the rest of that day. It meant that whatever had happened to my salary had not come from some faceless policy in Lagos. It had come from Kabiru. If this is the kind of story that keeps you curious right till the very end, this is exactly the moment to hit subscribe, because everything I found out after that phone call completely changed how I understood the man I had worked for 6 years. I approached Kabiru 2 days later, choosing my words as carefully as I could, requesting a private moment in his office rather than raising it in passing, because I wanted him to understand this mattered enough for me to ask for his full attention. I told him I had noticed a discrepancy in my new salary and asked if he could help me understand it. He leaned back in his chair, unhurried, the same easy composure he carried into every difficult conversation, and told me that the entire regional operations structure had undergone a harmonization review that quarter, adjusting several regional roles across the company to align pay bands more consistently with head office standards, and that while my title had moved up, my previous salary apparently had been slightly above band for my old role, meaning the harmonization had brought it back in line even as my responsibilities increased. He spoke with such fluency, such practiced calm, that for a moment I found myself nodding along, the way you sometimes nod at an explanation before your own instincts have fully caught up to object to it. He reminded me gently that these kinds of adjustments were common in growing companies, that Zenith Horizon was simply maturing its compensation structures like larger competitors had already, and that he understood how disorienting it must feel to see a number go down, even as a title went up, but that the long-term trajectory of my career at the company remained, in his words, extremely bright. He assured me this was purely procedural, unrelated to my performance, and that he personally would look into whether anything could be adjusted going forward. A promise phrased loosely enough, I would later realize, to commit him to nothing at all. I left his office that afternoon feeling strangely unsettled, despite his reassurance. The way you feel after being told something logical that nonetheless does not sit comfortably in your chest. I told myself I was being paranoid, that 6 years of trust deserved at least a little patience before I allowed suspicion to take root. But over the following days, small details kept resurfacing in my mind. The particular way Kabiru's eyes had not quite met mine when he mentioned my old salary being above band, a detail I had never once heard raised in any of my previous performance reviews, where my compensation had always been discussed as entirely appropriate for my role. I wanted to believe him. 6 years of trust does not disappear in a single conversation, however uneasy that conversation leaves you. But something about his explanation did not sit right. And over the following 2 weeks, I began quietly asking questions of my own, the kind of careful, patient digging you do when you are not yet ready to accuse anyone of anything, but you can no longer accept an explanation that does not add up. I started with Fatima, my closest colleague, over a quiet dinner at her flat one evening, away from the office, where conversations always felt like they carried the risk of being overheard by the wrong person. She had access to certain HR correspondence through her role in customer relations administration, though not to payroll directly, and I watched her expression shift from casual interest to genuine concern as I laid out everything that had happened. She told me something that made my stomach tighten. As far as she was aware, no company-wide harmonization exercise had been communicated to staff that quarter, and she would have expected at least an internal memo or town hall mention of something affecting compensation structures across the business, the kind of announcement HR typically made with considerable fanfare to manage staff anxiety. She promised to quietly ask around, carefully, without revealing why she was asking. Over the following week, she reported back that none of the other regional managers she had spoken to, in Kaduna or Kano, had mentioned any similar adjustment affecting their teams, and that the phrase grade harmonization did not appear anywhere in the internal HR bulletins she had access to for that entire quarter. If a genuine harmonization review had taken place across the company, surely more than one office would have felt its effects, and surely HR would have documented it formally, rather than leaving it to be explained inconsistently by individual managers on an as-needed basis. I then reached out carefully and informally to a former colleague named Ibrahim, who had transferred to a similar operations manager role in our Kaduna office the previous year, someone I still considered a friend despite the distance and the time that had passed since we worked side by side. I called him on a Sunday afternoon, framing it as harmless curiosity about how the Kaduna office was doing generally, before steering the conversation to whether his salary had changed at all in recent months due to any restructuring. He told me plainly, without any hesitation that might have suggested he was choosing his words carefully, that nothing of the sort had happened in Kaduna, that his pay had remained stable and had in fact increased slightly in the last quarter due to a standard annual review that every operations manager in his office had received on schedule. Whatever had happened to my salary, it was not a company-wide policy. It was something specific to the Abuja regional office under Kabiru's direct authority, and the realization of that settled over me with a weight I had not fully braced myself for. I began keeping careful records after that, screenshots of every payslip going back 18 months, copies of my promotion letter, the email from HR confirming the new reporting structure, and dated notes of every conversation I had with Kabiru or payroll about the matter, time-stamped and detailed, the way you learn to protect yourself once you sense that the official story does not match what is actually happening around you. It was Fatima, 3 weeks later, who brought me the piece of information that finally made everything click into place. Information she had come across almost by accident while helping process an unrelated HR request that had required her to cross-reference departmental budget codes against staff records. She called me late one evening, her voice lower than usual, asking whether I could come over rather than discussing it over the phone. And I remember the short drive to her flat that night feeling longer than it should have, some instinct already warning me that whatever she had found was not going to be small.
Our department, she told me once I was seated across from her, quietly and with visible discomfort at having to share it, had in fact received a real budget adjustment that quarter, but it was not a harmonization review at all. It was a reallocation, approved directly by Kabiru, to fund a substantial, undisclosed salary increase for another staff member in our regional office, a man named Yakubu Ibrahim, a team lead in logistics coordination, who, Fatima reminded me gently, watching my face carefully as she said it, happened to be Kabiru's wife's younger brother. I sat with that name for a long moment, turning it over, trying to place him properly in my memory. Yakubu had joined the company perhaps 2 years earlier, transferred in from a smaller subsidiary under circumstances nobody in the office had ever discussed in much detail. And while he was pleasant enough in the few interactions I had shared with him, his performance reviews, as far as I understood from casual departmental conversation, had been solidly average, competent but unremarkable, the kind of steady, unspectacular work that earns a standard raise, not an extraordinary one. Fatima confirmed, after a bit more careful digging over the following days, that Yakubu's connection to Kabiru through marriage had never once been disclosed in any HR filing, despite company policy requiring managers to formally declare any familial or close personal relationships with staff under their direct or indirect authority, precisely to prevent situations exactly like this. If you are anything like me, subscribe right now, because I promise you the story does not stop there, and what I uncovered next went back much further than I ever imagined. I want to be careful here and tell you exactly what I confirmed, because a story like this can easily tip into gossip if you are not disciplined about the facts. What I confirmed, through a combination of Fatima's cautious help and a formal records request I eventually filed with HR once I decided to take the matter seriously, was this. Yakubu Ibrahim's salary had increased by nearly 40% that same quarter, a figure that exceeded even the most generous standard annual raise at our company by a wide margin. The total cost of that increase, when set against our department's fixed staffing budget for the year, matched almost exactly the amount that had been quietly removed from my own new salary. Kabiru had not run a genuine harmonization review. He had needed to fund a significant and difficult to justify raise for his brother-in-law without drawing scrutiny from head office, and rather than request additional budget through proper channels which would have invited questions he didn't want to answer, he offset the cost internally, using my promotion as the cover. He could tell the wider office and Lagos that I was promoted generously, while privately ensuring the numbers on paper never actually cost the department anything extra, because the raise he truly wanted to protect was not mine. Even that discovery, as painful as it was, did not fully explain why Kabiru had chosen me specifically to absorb that cost out of every role and every team member under his authority. There were, after all, other senior staff in the department whose budgets theoretically could have been trimmed, other ways to quietly fund a family member's raise without touching the very person he had just publicly celebrated. That answer came from a conversation I almost didn't have, with a woman named Zainab who had worked for Kabiru's personal assistant for nearly a decade before retiring the previous year. Someone Fatima's mother knew personally from church and agreed to meet with me for tea one Saturday afternoon.
Zainab was a careful woman, the kind who had clearly spent a decade learning exactly how much to say and how much to keep to herself. And I understood, watching her weigh her words at that small table, that she was doing something she considered a genuine risk to her own peace by speaking to me at all. When I gently explained what had happened, she grew quiet for a long moment, stirring her tea slowly, before telling me something Kabiru himself had never once hinted at in 6 years of working beside him. 3 years before my promotion, during a company-wide strategy retreat held at a resort outside Abuja, I had been asked, almost as an afterthought by one of the facilitators, to present an alternative billing reconciliation model I had developed on my own time, something I had built initially just to make my own workload more manageable, rather than as any kind of formal proposal. The model ultimately impressed the managing director enough that he interrupted the session to ask detailed questions directly, and later, over dinner that same evening, raised in front of senior regional managers, including Kabiru, the question of whether junior and mid-level staff like me were being given enough visibility within the organization, remarking, half-jokingly but pointedly enough that the room grew quiet, that he wondered how many other Halimas were sitting quietly beneath layers of management across the company, doing exceptional work nobody in Lagos ever heard about. Zainab told me that Kabiru had left that retreat deeply unsettled, unusually quiet on the drive back to Abuja, and had confided in her privately in a rare unguarded moment weeks later that he felt overshadowed in his own department by someone several levels beneath him. Someone's talent had been noticed by leadership almost by accident in a way his own steady, careful management never quite seemed to attract the same attention. From that point on, she said, she had noticed him become quietly more careful about how much credit and visibility he allowed me, redirecting certain client-facing opportunities toward himself or toward more senior staff, even when I was clearly the person best equipped to handle them, even as he continued, in private, to rely heavily on my work behind the scenes, because whatever his discomfort, my competence remained too useful to set aside entirely. My public promotion, Zainab suggested, carefully choosing her words, was likely less about generosity and more about necessity. The pressure from head office to formally recognize my contributions had grown too obvious to keep ignoring, especially after that retreat became something senior leadership occasionally referenced in passing over the following years. A small but persistent reminder that sat, she believed, uncomfortably with Kabiru every time it resurfaced. But Kabiru, still carrying that old discomfort from 3 years earlier, had found a way to give me the title everyone expected him to give me, while making sure I would not gain the one thing that might have made me feel and appear like a genuine equal within the regional hierarchy, the salary that should have come with it. I sat with that explanation for a long time after Zainab shared it, turning over 3 years of small interactions in my memory, moments I had once read as ordinary management caution, project decisions, meeting invitations I had been quietly left off, that now looked in this new light like the careful maintenance of a hierarchy Kabiru had never wanted disturbed. Please subscribe if this story has kept you as gripped as it kept me living through it, because what I did next is the part I am proudest of in this entire ordeal. I did not go to Kabiri again. I understood by that point that returning to him with what I now knew would only give him time and warning to smooth over whatever he needed to smooth over before anyone else could look at it properly. I went instead directly to HR, requesting a formal meeting with our head of human resources, a calm, precise woman named Ngozi Adeyemi, who had a reputation across the company for taking staff grievances seriously rather than quietly managing them away, a reputation I had heard whispered about admiringly by colleagues in other departments over the years, though I had never once needed to test it myself until now. I spent the night before that meeting at my dining table, laying out every document I had gathered across its surface like evidence at a trial, arranging and rearranging them until the story they told, taken together, could not be mistaken for anything else other than exactly what it was. I brought with me 18 months of pay slips laid out side by side, showing clearly the gap between what I earned before my promotion and what I earned after it, my signed promotion letter with its explicit new title and expanded responsibilities, notes from my conversations with Tunde in payroll and with Kabiru himself, and a written account, careful and factual rather than emotional, of everything Fatima and Zainab had shared with me, presented not as accusations but as information HR was welcome to independently verify through their own channels.
I remember sitting in Ngozi's office that morning, my folder of documents on my lap, feeling a strange mixture of fear and calm I had not expected. Fear because I understood I was formally accusing my direct manager of a serious ethical violation, a step that could not easily be undone once taken, regardless of how the audit eventually concluded. Calm because for the first time in weeks, I was no longer simply absorbing something confusing and unfair. I was finally doing something about it, methodically, with facts rather than emotion leading the way. Ngozi listened without interrupting me once, occasionally making notes, her expression giving very little away until I reached the part about the budget reallocation tied to Yakubu Ibrahim's salary increase and his undisclosed relationship to Kabiru. At that point, she set her pen down entirely and asked me to confirm slowly everything I had just said, her voice carrying a new gravity that had not been there moments before. She then explained plainly that this matter would need to move beyond her office to a formal internal audit, given what I was describing touched not just a compensation dispute, but a potential conflict of interest violation involving a family relationship that was never disclosed through proper channels, as company policy required, and that such matters typically involved Zenith Horizon's internal audit team working alongside a compliance officer from Lagos head office. She thanked me with what I believed was genuine sincerity for bringing the matter forward with such thorough documentation rather than simply accepting the situation quietly, telling me that far too many staff, in her experience, chose silence over the discomfort of a formal complaint, allowing exactly this kind of quiet misconduct to continue unchecked for years. The audit took 5 weeks. I will not pretend those 5 weeks were easy. Kabiru grew visibly colder toward me during that period, his easy charm from earlier years replaced by a clipped, formal politeness that felt almost more unsettling than open hostility would have been, though he never once acknowledged that he knew what I had reported. He must have known, or at least suspected, given the questions the internal audit team began quietly asking around the office, questions that inevitably found their way back to him about departmental budget approvals from that quarter. The atmosphere in our regional office grew tense in a way that everyone could feel, even if most people did not know exactly why. Colleagues exchanging uneasy glances in the hallway, meetings that had once run long with easy conversation, now finishing in exactly the allotted time with nothing extra. I found myself more than once during those 5 weeks wondering whether I had made a mistake, whether the temporary discomfort of a smaller salary might have been an easier path than the slow, grinding uncertainty of watching a formal investigation unfold around a man I had once deeply respected. There were mornings I dreaded walking into that office, unsure whether I would find support or quiet resentment from colleagues who perhaps blamed me for the tension now hanging over the department. But Fatima stood beside me the entire time, meeting me for lunch most days, even when it meant walking past Kabiru's office under his watchful, unreadable gaze. And I will always be grateful that her quiet courage in coming forward with what she knew, at real risk to her own standing in the company, gave me the confidence to see the process through, rather than quietly accepting a smaller salary out of fear of exactly this kind of discomfort. My mother, when I finally told her the full story, rather than the simplified version I had first shared, listened carefully and then told me something I have carried with me since, that a debt owed quietly is still a debt, and that a woman who accepts less than she is worth to keep the peace often finds that the peace was never really hers to keep in the first place. I thought about my father too during those long weeks, about the discipline with which he had driven that commercial bus through Kaduna's traffic every single day without complaint. And I found myself hoping, somewhat irrationally, that he would have been proud of the harder, more uncomfortable choice I had made, rather than the easier, quieter one. When the audit concluded, HR confirmed everything I documented. There had been no genuine harmonization review. The budget reallocation had been approved by Kabiru without the required disclosure of his family relationship to the staff member receiving the increase.
a clear violation of the company's conflict of interest policy. My salary was restored in full, backdated to the month of my promotion, with the shortfall paid to me as a lump sum alongside my next payroll cycle. Yakubu's raise was reviewed separately and significantly reduced to align the standard grade bands for his role, though he was not dismissed, since the audit found no evidence that he himself had requested or orchestrated the arrangement. He appeared, from what I later learned, to have been as unaware of the full mechanics behind his increase as I had been unaware of the true reason behind my cut. Kabiru did not lose his job. I want to be honest with you about that, because I know some of you watching this expected a cleaner ending. He received a formal written warning, was required to complete a mandatory ethics and compliance retraining, and was removed from any future authority over compensation decisions within our region, with that responsibility transferred permanently to a compensation committee that now includes HR representation on every regional team, a policy change that came directly out of my case and now protects every other manager and staff member in our regional structure from experiencing what I went through in silence. Please subscribe now if you have made it this far, because the way this story ends is not the way I expected it to end when I first opened that payslip in my car outside my mother's house. My relationship with Kabiru has never fully recovered, and I do not think it ever will. We still work in the same regional office, still sit in the same leadership meetings, and he is unfailingly professional with me now, careful, correct, and entirely without the easy warmth he once showed me in my early years under him. Warmth I now understand was never entirely separate from his need to keep me comfortable enough not to look too closely at how I was being valued. Some days I missed that warmth, even knowing now what it had been quietly protecting, because grief for a working relationship you once trusted is its own particular kind of loss, quieter than other losses, but no less real. Other days, I am simply grateful that I no longer have to wonder whether my work is truly seen, because the audit made certain, in writing, in numbers, no one could later dispute that it was. Fatima and I remain closer perhaps than before, bound now by something neither of us fully expected to share when she first sat across from me at her dining table, with information she could easily have chosen to keep to herself. Yakubu, for his part, has never once raised the matter with me directly, though our interactions remain polite enough on the rare occasions our paths cross in the office, and I have chosen, for my own peace, to believe Zainad's assessment that he was as unaware of the full arrangement as I once was. I think often about how close I came to accepting that first explanation, to telling myself that grade harmonization was simply an unfortunate but legitimate cost of moving up and letting the matter rest rather than digging further. I think about how easily a company or a person can dress up a taking away as a giving if you are grateful enough to the giving to stop asking questions about what came with it. If there's one thing I want you to carry away from my story, it is this. A promotion is not proof that someone values you, and a public celebration is not the same thing as private honesty. If something about your own compensation, your own recognition ever feels off, even slightly, even in a company you have trusted for years, trust that feeling enough to ask the second question and the third, and to keep records before you ever suspect you might need them. The people who count on your gratitude to keep you quiet are rarely as careful as they think they are, and the truth, when you go looking for it properly, has a way of eventually paying its own way to the surface. If this story meant something to you, subscribe to this channel, because I have more stories like mine to share. Stories about the quiet battles people fight at work and at home to be seen and paid fairly for what they truly give. And I promise you, none of them end the way you expect them to either.